Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a spaniel ear in acrylics. Now the first thing I'm doing for this study is just getting a general base foundation of the fur around or below the ear, and this is going to help for me to overlap those ear details on the very edge. Now when I work with a pet portrait I won't actually paint the neck first, and I'll leave the lower part of the ear unfinished, and when I get to work on the neck I'll paint that in, get that complete, and then I'll add those final details on the lower part of the ear. But for this detail, to make sure that I could include all of that in that section of the tutorial whilst I was painting, I did want to get the fur in around it. Now the first thing that I'm going to be focusing on here is a good base foundation. Now getting a good base foundation for any fur is really important. So here I'm just using a round brush to map in my main darker shapes. Now when I'm painting spaniel ears or longer overlapping fur like this, I will always focus on the main lights and darks. So you can see here that I'm just mapping in the darkest value, and actually this layer is going to end up pretty much blocked in. However, I'm still taking the time to map in the fur direction, and although some of this is going to get covered when I come back in with more of this darker paint, I'm following that reference photo with the fur direction right from this first layer. Now the reason I feel that that's important is because I'm already studying that reference photo, so when I come in with my details I'm already used to moving my brush in more of that accurate way, and I just feel it helps for me to follow that reference photo more accurately as I work. When working with acrylics, it's really important to use the right layering process, and that's going to vary depending on the fur texture that we're painting. But the drying time is also important. Now as we know, acrylics do dry fairly quickly, but we can slow that drying time down if we need to by using a fine mist spray bottle. Now I didn't have to do that with any of the tutorial here, but I do have lessons here on YouTube and of course the step-by-step versions on Patreon where I focus on how to keep that paint wet for longer, where we might be needing to blend those larger areas. But for this, I used that faster drying time to my advantage so that I could really work through this layering process a little quicker. Now whilst I was waiting for the base layer to dry, I then worked on the neck. Now that I'd worked on the neck and got a hint of that detail, I can then come back and do my second layer on the ear. Now at this stage, I'm basically just tidying up the first layer. So this is where I'm hinting more at the accurate placement of my lights and my darks. Now at this stage you don't want to be jumping into using your brightest highlights, you want to save those for your later layers, but here you can start to see that I'm hinting at the fur that is grouped together and it is darker. So it's just light enough to show up on top of that darker base layer. Now as I start to come in with these lighter layers, my main priority is to make sure that I capture the contrast right, but also the flow of the fur. I'm not necessarily trying to make each section of fur completely accurate to that reference photo. If it's a couple of millimeters off, that's not anything I worry about, but I do want to make sure that the direction of that fur is correct. So you can see that I've got many curves, it dips, it raises up in certain places, and that's going to help to make that fur look like it's longer and flowing. Now my biggest tip when working with longer fur is you don't want to have one consistent longer brushstroke from the very top all the way down to the bottom, because you're going to end up with something that looks a little bit more like spaghetti, which of course we want to avoid. So by breaking that up and focusing on the main clumps, those main lights and darks, you'll avoid that from happening. Because what's really important here is you wouldn't be able to identify one single individual strand from the very top to the bottom. This fur is not as long from the top of the ear to the bottom, so it is broken up, and it's the way that it overlaps different sections of fur that gives the impression that the waves and the curls are shorter. But of course it's significantly longer than the fur on the body, so we do need to be making sure that we are adjusting our brush strokes accordingly. Now regarding the fur direction, I've got a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I speak about three main things regarding the brush technique. That's fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now again, I've briefly mentioned there the importance of fur direction. You do want to make sure that you've got a really nice variety, and as I'm coming back in and adding more highlights, you can really see how I'm exaggerating more of those curves. Now the thickness of the brush strokes is going to be determined by a couple of factors. Most of all, it's the pressure that's applied to the brush. So where I'm now using this liner brush, if I want to create a thicker line, I'll use a little bit more pressure. If I want to create a thinner line and more of an individual strand, then I'll really ease off of the pressure. However, the consistency of paint, so the paint versus water and how much should be used, will also help to determine the thickness of that brushstroke. So all of these aspects is something that I do cover thoroughly in the real-time step-by-step version on Patreon. Now, the length of the brushstrokes is going to of course be determined by how long that fur is in that reference photo. So there are some sections of fur here that are shorter and others that are significantly longer. So you want to be adjusting how long that brush is in contact with the surface, and that's going to really help to give you again more of that natural variety. Now at this stage here, I'm starting to work with glazes to adjust the colour of the fur. Now I've got a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for working with glazes. I show various different painting examples depending on the sort of glazing effect that I'm trying to create. I'll also pop a link to that glazing video in the description below if it's of interest. But here what I wanted to do is use a glaze to adjust the colour of that fur so that I could break it up into two main processes. I'm focusing on building up my values first, and again here I'm using a slightly lighter mixture. I can wait for that to dry and then I can apply a glaze to adjust the colour more accurately for what I can see in my reference photo. Now if colour selection and how to mix the colours is something that you find more challenging at the moment, then working with glazes can really help to simplify that process. If we're painting realistic fur and we're also focusing on trying to mix the exact colour in that reference photo at the same time as using the brush technique and the values of that paint, then it can all become quite overwhelming. So by working on glazes here, you can really break it up into two main steps and make it far easier to tackle. Now because using glazes can really make that colour selection and colour mixing process far easier, it is of course something that I cover thoroughly in my step-by-step tutorials on Patreon. Now for these top layers of detail, I'm using a smaller liner brush, and in order to get a liner brush to work effectively, the paint consistency is really important. So you want to have the right balance between water and paint, and if you have too much paint in your mixture, you're going to get start and stop points within that one line that you're creating. If you have too much water, then the opposite is going to happen and you're going to end up with either a transparent detail or one that even runs. So if you have both of those options, then what you need to do is add a little bit more paint to that mixture to make it a little bit thicker. Now the more you use a liner brush, the consistency of the paint does get easier, and just like anything, it just takes practice. But one thing that I do recommend when new to using a liner brush is it can be really beneficial to just use some watercolour paper and black paint and get used to creating a range of different line effects with a liner brush. That therefore means that you're more confident when you use that brush on your full projects. And what I was also doing with that liner brush is making sure to have some of those longer details that overlap the background. Now those details are very important, just like the ones on the lower part of the ear. It's going to help to make that subject look like it's actually part of that painting rather than a sticker that's just been stuck on. So when you are working with painting a spaniel, they'll have lots of lovely bits of fur that overlap that background. You want to make sure that you capture all of the curves, the variety, the way that that paint on brush should be moved in a different way to capture that natural look. Now as I'm working more with my glazes and the lighter layers, you can really see how important it's been to get that base foundation dark enough. I haven't yet had to come in here with darker paint and really make any major changes, and that's because I was brave with how dark the base layer was to start with. Now quite often it's one of the common issues where we don't have enough contrast as we continue to layer. Now what I mean by that is the base layer isn't dark enough to start with, so everything else ends up too light. So what I want to be focusing on at that initial stage is looking at that reference photo and putting in my darkest value that I see in that area that I'm working on. Now it just so happened that I felt that there was a lot of dark layers in between those clumps of fur, so it meant that the whole ear had to be fairly dark. But if I was working on a lighter photo of a spaniel, you may not need to have so much of a darker base layer. It of course is going to depend on the reference photo that you're working from. Now the main priority for this lesson on Patreon was to focus on the spaniel ear, but I did decide to make it look like this was more of a complete project. I did decide to paint the eye and the surrounding fur, just to finish it off. Now when I worked on this, I'm not getting it up to the same level of detail. It still looks realistic because I'm focusing on my values, but there isn't as many details here as there may be if it was a full spaniel portrait. But regardless of that, you're going to see how I build up that layering process gradually. You can see here again, I'm paying attention to the lights and the darks. I'm not putting one solid colour down, and I'm really paying attention to getting that base layer fairly well blended. This again is avoiding those harsh start and stop points, with the exception of the white stripe between the eyes. At the moment, of course, that's just blank with the background showing through, but I'm now going to be starting to add a little bit more of the definition around the eye and breaking it up into small manageable chunks. Now, I wouldn't normally work on a whole base layer for one side of the face, but because this was a smaller painting, only a 5x7, I was working in a little bit more of a larger area. But going forward here, you can see that I just focus on the eye. I get that area right, and then I start moving on to the fur around it. This for me is one way that I prevent myself from becoming overwhelmed. If I break it up into small manageable chunks and then the individual layers, it just makes it far easier to tackle. So going back to brush technique quickly, you can really see how this fur is significantly shorter than that on the ear. So my brush strokes are much shorter, they're finer, where I'm making sure to hint at more individual hairs rather than the clumped, wavier fur of the ear. By adjusting my brush strokes, I'm using the same liner brush here, but by adjusting how I'm using that, I'm able to create a different texture. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you're interested in painting along to this or any of my other step-by-step tutorials, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. But if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.